Hello, everyone, and welcome to Six Wives. My name is James, and I'm here with Gareth Russell. Gareth is an historian and the author of many works, most recently in 2019 with his account of the Titanic disaster, entitled The Ship of Dreams, The Sinking of the Titanic and the End of the Edwardian Era. The subject of this interview is his 2017 biography of Catherine Howard, entitled Young and Damned and Fair, The Life and Tragedy of Catherine Howard at the Court of Henry VIII. Welcome, Gareth. How are you today?
Very well, James. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, well, thank you for your time. I am so excited to talk with you about Catherine Howard. And, well, I think I finished rereading again this morning. So I've never been more prepared. And you have many
Yeah.
questions. I hope you don't mind.
No, that's great. I mean, it'll be fresher in your mind than mine, but hopefully the suppressed memories of many days spent in the archives will bring it swimming back to me.
Yes, hopefully. Right. So my first question for you, Gareth, is to ask, when and how is it that Catherine Howard first came to your attention?
It's interesting, sort of emotionally. I mean, the first thing I ever saw as a child about the Tudors was the movie Anne of the Thousand Days, which was being broadcast on Irish television. And my father was a big Richard Burton fan, so I watched, I think I was 7 or 8. So Anne Boleyn was sort of the first one, and then my parents took me to the old BBC store on Fountain Street in Belfast and said I could pick a video as a treat. And they had the old VHS tapes of the 1970 series, The Six Wives of Henry VIII. And I don't know why I picked Catherine Howard over Anne Boleyn, because I was sort of obsessed as a child, but I did. And so that was the first time I sort of picked her without realizing. And then later, when I was 18, I wrote an article, sort of a potted biography offer for a competition. And then in 2011, when I was doing my master's in medieval history at Queen's University in Belfast, I had pitched the idea of doing my dissertation on the Queen's household to my supervisor, Dr. James Davis. And initially I had said I sort of wanted to do a broader overreach of the Queen's household, really from either the time of Margaret of Anjou or Elizabeth Woodville through to Catherine Parr. And James Davis said, quite rightly, he said, you won't get enough detail for a postgraduate thesis. Pick one of the shorter queens and go into detail. And fortunately for me, and unfortunately for them, Henry VIII provides a fairly decent roster of short tenured queens. And again, I ended up picking Catherine sort of without really realizing why I was, drawn to her. It was quite pragmatic that I thought, well, you can see a household being formed. You can see it on tour because she toured the North in 1541. And also it offers me as the historian a chance to see a household unraveling. So really, she was picked with brutally utilitarian reason to be the focus of this thesis. And halfway through, another professor at Queen's, Professor Catherine Clinton, said, I think she and her career are emerging differently enough from this research that you're doing that it might merit an actual biography of her. So that's sort of the 3 stages of how Catherine grabbed me and wouldn't let go.
I do love those earliest impressions of history and how how you could never have known back then that you were going to write a biography or dedicate so many years of your life to writing or researching and writing this particular work.
Absolutely. And I have to I have to give great thanks to my parents, who I'm sure there was a part of them that regretted encouraging me to watch Anne of the Thousand Days with them, as our family home was just, slowly but very definitely inundated with books on the Tudors. They're still they're still in our family study at home. There's just mountains upon books. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that moment of watching Anne of the Thousand Days and being sort of completely entranced as a child. that did have such a big impact. And it's sort of interesting to see where, what popular culture can do in sort of spurring you on into a more academic pursuit of the truth.
Why do you think your focus then was initially on the Queen's household specifically?
Well, it seemed to, I mean, you sort of know yourself, James, that you're under not pressure, but certainly guidance in academia for any sort of postgraduate thesis, certainly MA, very much so with PhD. From what I can tell, that I can remember the emphasis was find something that merits research, that is different, and that's actually going to contribute to the academic discussions of this period. And it did seem to me that what queenship is such a rich kind of developing part of Tudor history, where we see things like Dr. Lane Smith's book on the later medieval queens, and we're seeing a lot of monographs coming out about queenship. I mean, Estelle Perrin's just co-edited one, I think, with Valerie Schutt about sort of minor queens and how even they are significant in the history of European monarchy. But it seemed to me that I hadn't really encountered a lot on the household. So within this very interesting realm of queenship, it seemed to me that there was something that could be said about the household and the both the vast economic clout that it gave Queen's consort at the time, and also that these servants surrounded these very important women, arguably far more than their husbands did. And I think sometimes we see these queens in isolation, but I think a career and the phenomenon of a career is often better explained by looking at who they were interacting with every day.
That's the impression that I got from reading Young and Damned and Fair, is that I have read books on Catherine Howard, but I felt like I saw her in a different manner by seeing her through the eyes of those people who knew her best, who perhaps were intimate enough to actually know the real Catherine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it certainly did. And there are sometimes, when I reread it, James, I think, I could have been clearer that I was critiquing this point. But in general, I think I did try to nail my colours metaphorically to the mast by saying I have tried to ignore as much as I can the previous perception I had of her, and to be led by her own words, both when she was clearly lying and also fundamentally when she was telling the truth. And I think there are times with Catherine where she, I had some reviewers say that I was far too harsh on her, and others that I was far too soft on her. And I think that I take that as a sign, hopefully, that I kind of got it right. Because she emerged just as so much more interesting, I think, than the figure of sort of vixen or passive victim. She certainly was a victim of just how brutal her society was. But the course of the research, yes, did show her as someone much, much more compelling than I had initially anticipated. And I say at the end of the book, I think I said she was mediocre, and that's not to insult her. History isn't, the majority of people, both in the past and in the present, are not people like Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn or Thomas Cromwell or Martin Luther. They're not these sort of like towering history changers. Catherine was very charming. One of the things that blew my mind, that I really try to stress the quotes in the book, are how impressed her contemporaries were by how beautifully mannered she was. So I think there was a good deal of dignity there. But in terms of sort of extraordinary intellect or extraordinary ambition, that was not there in her. That's not to say she was stupid, but actually I think in her case, it means that you have someone who is very relatable to a lot of people. And it shows that the time she lived in was so brutal that it destroyed people who were ambitious, like Anne Boleyn and Thomas Cromwell were, but it also destroyed thousands of people like Catherine who did not want to get caught up in these great political games. So to me, that was probably the validating thing, finding a completely different impression of her.
How did you adapt your postgraduate dissertation into a full-length study of Catherine and like widening the scope? Did you find that your impression or interpretation of Catherine changed at all?
Certainly. I say in the biography, no person is an island. We're all shaped by the world around us. And being able to widen the scope made some of her actions more understandable when set in context. Actually widening the scope, James, was probably the core difference in it. And I did a lot of research. I say in the introduction, this is as much a study of the people around, the world around her, as it is of her, because I think too often biographies isolate and inflate the solitary importance of their figure, and I don't think that's always very helpful. But I also did have to go back over certain things. I mean, there were certain conclusions I reached in the thesis that, once I really, got into having the time to research the lives of various extended relatives and servants, I could tweak that a bit. So she probably came into more focus because in many ways, she was not the focus of the dissertation. The household was, and she... and her career was. So her personality was not really relevant to the thesis, whereas of course it is to a biography. That's part of your duty as a biographer, I think, to tell the story as it happened, as much as you can discern from your research, and to present the person that you are writing about and making a living off. To write that person with the humanity and respect and humility that shows them as they were, not as you wanted them to be. And I think in many cases in biographies, we do see way, way too often that the writer has decided before they start who this person was, and they are going to twist and distend or ignore evidence that gets in the way. And crucially, which I think, I'm sure you've come across it in some debates, there are a lot of times where, particularly online, critiques of an author's work stray very quickly into a critique of the person. And so I think what in terms of that and writing the biography, I had to put all of that out of my head and say, fundamentally, this is not about what kind of online chatter says or what reviewers will think. My duty is to Catherine's story, and that includes the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I think probably the big difference in widening the scope from the thesis to the biography was putting her at the center of it, and my duty to her and her story at the center of my sort of working life.
On the topic of Catherine's personality, then, would you say it is valid or true? Say if it's up to the reader to interpret the evidence in their own way, and yes, some of us, say not readers but writers, come and we might have preconceptions about the person before we've really began, and we do our best to set those aside and look at the evidence as objectively as possible. But do you think then that this means that there might be, we all have our own impression? So I have my Catherine and you have your Catherine, and in that case, when I ask you who is your Catherine, is she the most historically accurate Catherine that we've come upon, or and in that case, then how does she then differ from the young girl that we may have met before?
Well, I hope she is the most historically accurate. I certainly spent years researching it, and even I lived with Catherine, or the Catherine that the documents give to us. I retraced her tour of the North. When I was writing this book, I started in London and went up and came back. I visited, every spot that she was. I stayed in the hotel that's now on the, the site of where her grandmother's London mansion was. I was a man obsessed, and I did my best to tell the truth, but don't ask the document. Again, you're right. The caveat is the documents give to us. But I think part of the reason by that is I didn't have a really clear opinion on Catherine before, in an odd way. I mean, I had a very vague perception of someone who was, who had made questionable decisions, but who fundamentally was a total and complete victim. And I think what often happens is, actually probably what this book taught me to do is to reevaluate even that terminology, and to think it is possible to be a victim, as Catherine was, but also to, I think you'd have to be brutal and ill-informed to say that that the execution was inevitable once she started behaving in the way that she did. I don't think that's true. I blame Henry more than I blame Catherine.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's just baffling. People often say, I don't know if you come across that, they're like, you have to understand the concept of the time. And I'm like, I do understand that context. I studied it in order to understand it. Believe me, Henry VIII's actions were not normal. Executing queens was not the done thing. I mean, it really, that sort of always blows my mind, that I think we're so used to what happened to Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard that we think it was a foregone conclusion, and it really wasn't. People were shocked at both executions.
It surprised me reading through the book that how significant and how important it was that there was this wider context to understand. You cannot simply isolate those days. Or at least maybe before I'd read the book, I might have been thinking about Catherine's execution in its kind of bubble, and not really considering that every step may have been leading up to it. And certainly I don't think it was inevitable after reading. I feel like you make a very convincing case for the narrative unfolding as it does.
Well, thank you, because we are blessed as historians with the fact that there are so many, not all, but there are enough surviving transcripts from Catherine's last few months alive in a way that it is actually quite rare to have that cache of sources. And so I just immersed myself in them and was constantly cross-checking the testimonies of servants, relatives, everyone that they interviewed between November 1541 and sort of, I think, well, they really finished by the middle of December, but say for the sake of argument, February. And to cross-check how accurate they were. And one of the things that, when I moved away from that and looked at the transcripts sort of from the Council and the House of Lords, and I realized that there was this sort of deep seated discomfort in late 1541 and early 1542 about executing her. Even the House of Lords seemed, not so much from sympathy for her personally, but respect for the position she had held as queen. There was a sort of blue-blooded solidarity from the House of Lords about executing her without a trial, and it was Henry who pushed through with it. I mean, this idea of Henry being very easily manipulated, I think, is, as a king, is tempered and possibly dismantled by looking at how involved he was in Catherine's downfall and how determined he was that she would die for this alleged humiliation of him. I mean, that was sort of the thing that blew my mind. And I tried to stress as much as I could, she wasn't executed for committing adultery. The treason laws after the break with the Vatican in the 1530s had been expanded under Henry to criminalize intention, to essentially criminalize thought. So they just had to prove that you had done something that looked as if you might at some point in the future commit treason. And her nocturnal meetings with Thomas Culpeper were used as that evidence. They didn't need to say that she was an adulteress. They just needed to say she behaved in a way that made adultery credible. So that, I mean, I think when you really go into the context, everything becomes both clearer and, in Henry and Catherine's case, infinitely more horrifying.
I think the interesting thing when it comes to Catherine is she is so often written or portrayed as factional bait, being dangled in front of Henry as if he was so easy to manipulate by her uncle Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, and Stephen Gardiner. And in your introduction, I believe it's in your introduction, you wrote that you became convinced in the midst of your research that the influence and intentions of Catherine's family had been exaggerated or at least misinterpreted. So do you think, with the idea of Henry as a puppet master or a puppet, is there any substance, anything at all, to the claim that Howard family influence or factionalism even played a role in Catherine's rise or fall?
That's probably the big takeaway from her rise in the book. That I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever, and in fact evidence against it, that they picked and pimped her, for want of a better word, and that they picked this beautiful orphaned young woman and deliberately planted her in front of Henry VIII. The timetable does not back that up. The contemporary evidence doesn't back that up. Comments the Duke of Norfolk made about something completely different don't back that up. And to me, again, so we talked about the widening of the scope. The thing that started me down this path of saying, actually, this established myth of Tudor history that the Howards pushed her forward is bunkum, it's nonsense, was the Duke of Norfolk went on a diplomatic mission for Henry to France in early 1540, and he was in a conversation with the King of France's sister, who sort of said to him, if you want to get on my brother's good side, you should flatter and befriend his mistress, the Duchess of Étampes. And Norfolk's kind of shrugged off the suggestion that a royal mistress could have any influence, and says something, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something to the effect that, could you really expect anything like that from a woman of that sort? And I thought that's a really interesting comment from someone who allegedly used female family members to become royal mistresses or queens in order to advance his cause. The fact that in 1540, on the, after Catherine had arrived at court and after the king had first shown some interest in her, her uncle, an alleged sort of Svengali, the Duke of Norfolk, is openly expressing and privately expressing the belief that royal mistresses are inconsequential and have no influence on politics, seemed to me a really an interesting clue. And I followed it, and I went through, comments made by the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, responses from the Privy Council, comments made by family servants, and what emerged to me was, I don't think that they were disappointed when Henry showed interest in her. I do think that as the relationship accelerated, particularly after Easter 1540, when it became clear that Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves was going to fail, and had in fact probably failed from before the wedding mass, that they did, they acted as chaperones and they acted as her advisors. That's made very clear in comments from the Privy Council and from the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk herself. But what I will say to that is, that seemed to me, I use the metaphor in the book, they played the hand dealt to them well, but they didn't stack the deck. And I think, it's very clear that Henry's interest in her was instant, sort of lust or love at first sight, and then it sort of died away and came back later. But my argument, crucially, is, by the point Henry was interested in her, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, her daughter, the Countess of Bridgewater, and her son, Lord William Howard, knew enough about what had gone on between Catherine and Francis Derham, and they were worried about it. That I think if they had had a choice in having to pick a member of the family to catch the king's interest. I think that it's clear that they would not have put Catherine forward. And in fact, from the minute it became clear that she was going to be queen, those members of the family who knew that she had had this quite serious relationship with Francis Derham went into damage control, and there is a sense of fear in them from the beginning that this scandal would come out. So I don't think that there was the intention or confidence in the family to put her forward. So that, I think, hopefully Young and Damned and Fair will lay to rest as much as you can when you're fighting against 400 years of assertion, this idea that the Howards acted in this sort of grotesque pimp-like fashion with this young woman.
Well, I will be the first to admit that that was my impression of Catherine and the family before I read Young and Damned and Fair. And one thing that really stuck out to me, and I think maybe reinforced this idea that there was a faction involved, or maybe at least the family, the immediate family anyway, was that why didn't anyone raise any objections to the marriage? Why didn't someone say something about Catherine's premarital indiscretions? It was so frustrating. It was like this ticking time bomb that you could just see. And it was, and the only thing I thought was the family must have had too much to gain. But that's a very simplistic interpretation of events, because as we were saying, Henry became infatuated with Catherine. And at that point, I think the question really is, did Catherine have a choice? I mean, certainly the family would not have objected, or maybe could not have objected, but did Catherine have a choice when she was being pursued by the king, or could she have refused him?
I don't think she could have. I mean, one of the things is that hope springs eternal. I mean, Anne Boleyn sort of quite rightly said that hope is the force that leads us from day to day, which is one of my favorite pieces of advice. But hope can also be quite dangerous. And I think you just have to look in everyday life at people who hope that things will work out well, and you hope that you'll beat the odds. And I think that probably was the case with the Howards and Catherine. But also, I think if they hope that this catastrophic information on her past wouldn't come out. But I would shift again some of the focus onto Henry and say he had arguably created such an environment and culture of fear at the heart of court, and the concept that disappointing him in any way was sort of anathema. He had created that and cultivated it, and it meant that people were not going to come forward to accuse the latest favorite. And in terms of saying no, the most revealing indicator, I think, is probably Catherine Parr, who more or less by her own admission did not want to marry him in 1543, and prayed and sort of figured that there was no way she could say no. And I think Catherine Howard was sort of in the same position, that that once he had cast his interest at her, had she confessed, or had the family told him, they would have her life would have been ruined. She would have been, she would have been dismissed from court. She probably wouldn't have been able to make a good marriage. And so I think, almost from the moment he began to really pursue her, I think a tragedy was in the offing. As you say, it was a ticking time bomb. But I think that was the culture that Henry, certainly by the start of the 1540s, that flowed from Henry VIII's style of leadership.
You mentioned that the surviving source material, it's often quite fragmentary. You have scraps to work with, but it has always struck me that with Catherine, there's a certain element of richness, at least in certain parts of her life, where we get this very clear, very coherent snapshot of what's going on in Catherine's immediate personal life. So my question for you, Gareth, is what would you say is the most important, or perhaps the most useful single surviving source for documenting Catherine's life?
God.
Sorry, I thought it was a fantastic question, but put you on the spot.
No. You're actually, well, there's, even as you were saying the question, James, there was one that sort of looms large in my head, which is the very long confession. that she gave to Cranmer that has not been published in other biographies of her for, I mean, I couldn't find anything that had published it since the 1820s. I can't say that for certain. Someone else could have found it, but it is rare. And that's why I quoted it in full, so that my readers and other historians will have it, because it is a tough one to track down. Which mercifully for us, Bishop Burnet wrote down, transcribed in the 1670s, because I think the original, there was a lot of damage that was done in a fire in 1731. So we're lucky that there was a backup. But this confession is very different in tone to the much more famous one that she made later the same day, that is often quoted. And it's one of the most extraordinary things to read, because it's so long and it's so detailed. And her voice comes out incredibly in this. She talks about, how annoying she found Francis Derham, and that, that he was, Francis Derham and Henry Mannix, I just think, in fact, I think, and you know what, every man near her husband, Thomas Culpeper, Francis Derham and Henry Mannix, I just find them a litany of horrors. And I kept trying to find, some extenuating feature, but it's not there. And this how clingy he was and possessive of her, and the sort of glorious way that she ended it. I was sort of cheering her on when she said, "Well, we're done. I'm going to court. You can cry all you want." And she gives also, this was a letter she gave to the Archbishop of Canterbury, but she gives these extraordinarily vivid descriptions of her life before she came to court, the kind of hats she liked, who she used as her embroiderer. It is long, it is fascinating, it's so dense with the flavor of her personality and her confidence and her sort of joie de vivre and the hope that she had for her life. So to me, that is the one that was both rare, in terms of its use by other historians, and just in general, it's rare to find, and also it really felt like she was speaking through it, for want of a better word. I just think that was the piece that I was most, I think I let out a yell of joy in the archives at about 2 a.m. when I found it. Yeah, that's the one. That is the one.
I think I would struggle to dispute that. It is certainly a source that, unlike the many others from the time, it really does have that voice. And for me, as much as I think if I read the evidence without that particular deposition or confession, I think I could come up with a different interpretation. But like you said, the personality really comes through. And I love that, because even for someone who was only queen so briefly, and you think we're never going to find anything about her because the material is so difficult, but she really does come through, and that is that. And I think you communicate that beautifully through Young and Damned and Fair in a way that I honestly don't think has been done before. I mean, I love Lacey Baldwin Smith's biography, but I don't know Catherine from that book. You know, I don't meet Catherine in that book. I learn a lot about, well, the Tudor court and the politics, but I didn't meet Catherine. And when you pick up a biography, you sort of are ready to meet someone. You know, you're like, okay, who is this person?
Yeah.
And I was very skeptical of any biography in the first place, knowing what the evidence was like. That could be about one of these queens, besides maybe Catherine of Aragon, because I suspected that the problem would be there would be nothing to work from. But you really don't get that sense from reading Young and Damned and Fair that there's that you're making up for a lack of material, or that you're trying to fill in the gaps with speculation. It just comes through in the most natural way.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to hear that, and I appreciate you saying it. I mean, it was a labor of love. Not that would have been the language I would have used to describe it sort of about 2 months before submission.
Of course.
When I had gone certifiably quite mad. But I it felt important to tell the truth about her and as much detail as I can, and to give back to her that voice that comes through in that confession. One thing that I didn't, when I pointed out that there were, particularly the depositions that she gave that are mutually contradictory. I mean, there's no way to reconcile the second and third confession that she gave, because they tell completely different versions of events, and she gave them on the same day. She now, the one that puts her in a much better light, she gave at second, and I did not, saying that she lied in certain places. I approached that with a heavy heart, because I did not want to look like I wasn't sympathizing with her. But when you have 7 servants' testimonies, all of them isolated from each other, that are all saying exactly the same thing to each other, and are saying, and some nobles as well, and they are all in contradiction of what she is saying, as a historian, it's not good enough to say, as some people have tried to say, well, clearly the servants were lying. If you're going to go into it having already decided that C is the answer, then you have no interest in A or B. And you have to, or sorry, D is the answer, so you get the wrong answer. You have to take into account lower or working class voices. You have to take into account the servants. And yes, and I called the servants out as well when I said this seems a bit too pat to be believed. But in fact, they had nothing to gain by lying. In fact, they had a lot. They had a lot to lose by it. I think I sort of talk about when I found the account of servants who were clearly terrified. They'd actually scratched out their own signature. They were so nervous. So I think that was kind of one of the things, because the people, who thought I was too sympathetic to her, that it was the issue of, they felt that when I pointed out that one of the confessions has to be a lie because they're mutually contradictory. Some reviewers did take issue with that, and they felt that I had not criticized her harshly enough for what they interpreted as her willingness to throw her servants under the metaphorical bus in order to save herself. And that, I do understand why people think that that's a sort of remorselessly unpleasant character trait. But I tried to imagine, or at least to, if I can't empathize, sympathize with a young woman, or any person really, who was isolated for days and was being drip-fed information, and had Cranmer says that she had worked herself up into sort of a frenzy of terror. So I tried not to judge her for that moment, and tried not to be too condemnatory in my language, because I think it's very easy, when you're sitting in a comfortable armchair 500 years later, to think that she should have behaved a different way. But when you are in these sort of, creaking, terrifying splendor of abandoned apartments, and your life is unraveling in front of you, and your husband has already shown that he's not shy about signing death warrants, I don't think you can really fairly critique her for whatever lies she told, and whatever truths also kind of tumbled out of her in that fear.
You mentioned that eureka moment that you had in the archives, where you came upon that particular document where things just fell into place. Would you also acknowledge that there was a fire at Ashburnham House in 1731, and so many of the manuscripts that we could be using were destroyed. So I suppose my question for you is, of those documents that we know existed at one time or another, that are either damaged or no longer exist, which would you say is perhaps the most tantalizing, and that you wish we could lay our eyes on today? Is there potentially a crucial piece of the puzzle that we are missing when it comes to Catherine?
I don't think there's a crucial piece, no. I think all the evidence that I could find that we have, I think there's no massive gap that we're trying to wonder, how did we end up with that horrible moment when she was executed. No, I don't think there's a crucial piece that's missing, but I do think there are things that are tantalizing. I would give maybe one of my fingers if I could see some of the feedback from the Countess of Bridgewater's interrogation in more detail. And I also would love to have seen some of the questions asked to some of Catherine's page boys, Morris and Webb, who carried some of her gifts to Thomas Culpeper, and some more of the detailed transcripts from servants who worked for her when she was queen. So some of the other ones I don't think are fully there. Just to you know, it would be wonderful to have a little bit more on what questions were asked of the servants. But that being said, we actually, I mean, even then, we do have a lot of other servants' testimonies that that tell a really rich and terrifying, just horrible story of what it was like to be caught up in this scandal as a sort of innocent bystander. But no, I don't think there's a crucial piece. But I would love. I mean, I would just love to see. The Countess of Bridgewater was one of my favorite people to go into more detail about, because I just think she was, you know, to use the parlance of the 1940s, she was a real dame. I mean, this woman was tough, and I liked her a lot. So I would love if some more of her stuff had survived, but I don't think it would fundamentally change the narrative.
I'm particularly drawn, because of the evidence sort of takes you that way, to the relationship between Catherine Howard and Thomas Culpeper. So what would you, I mean, what do you think was the true nature of this relationship between Catherine and Culpeper?
Well, I come out swinging pretty hard against the suggestion that it was blackmail based, which seems to be quite popular at the minute. I do not understand how you could possibly reach that conclusion. It's an unpleasant enough scenario without having to construct a conspiracy theory around it, which is what I think the blackmail, and it also just doesn't make any sense when you actually read her letter to him. You have to kind of cut it in odd places for that to be the interpretation. I really don't agree with that. I also fundamentally disagree with the suggestion that she was trying to get pregnant to pass a child off as the king's. I actually don't think they ever slept together. But so no, I don't think it was the blackmail or the bastard theory. I don't think it was either of those. I think it really reminded me of just what we can do when we are completely besotted by someone. I didn't run the risk of committing treason, but I look back on past relationships when I was younger and think, what in the name of God was I thinking? And I think we have to remember that I think she was besotted with him, and she tells, by her own admission, I don't think Catherine was a particularly emotional person. I don't think she was, as my late grandmother would say, a blubber. I don't think she comes across as much of a crier. And she sort of says that herself by saying that she was so wounded by discovering, this is before she was married and they were sort of lightly involved with each other. She tells him that she was so upset to discover that he had moved on to another woman of the court that she burst into tears in front of the other ladies in waiting. To Anne of Cleves. And that just seems, quite revealing to me that this was someone who, I think she was genuinely very interested in him. I can't fully comment on Culpeper. I sort of, we don't have the evidence to say what his attitude was, what his heart was. I think it emerges, to me anyway, and I like to put the evidence out there because I'm having a conversation with my readers, James. It's up to them to draw their conclusions. So I give the evidence pro and contra. I think to me, it looks like she was much more interested in him than he was in her. I use the example of Adeliza of Louvain and Henry I, and also Mary Boleyn and Margaret, Queen of Scots, that there was the possibility that when Henry VIII died, Catherine would be a very wealthy Queen Dowager, and that Culpeper might have been hedging his bets and hoped to become her second husband. Great ladies married beneath them all the time as widows. And so I think there was an element with Culpeper of lust. I certainly think there was a genuine amount of affection. Whether I would go so far as to call it love, I can't say. But yeah, I mean, I think it is a towering testament to the obfuscating lunacy of love. I mean, and or attraction. I think that's what it was. I don't think we need to overcomplicate it or make it any more horrific by these sort of like pseudo-mathematical theories about, this happened, so this happened. So that trying to construct a kind of theory about why humans behave the way they did. That's not, humanity's a mess. It's a glorious mess. And that is what I think Thomas and Catherine were.
That is a very apt description. I will say that although it may seem like I would be a little bit biased because I've just read the book, I remember going through this evidence myself before the publication of Young and Damned and Fair, and my conclusion was that this relationship was genuine. And genuine, I'm so glad you used the word genuine, because the evidence is so human. You can hear their conversations, and we shouldn't know them. We should never have heard them, but Lady Rochford was there in the shadows, listening to every word, and it's just like, or whoever, and it's just so. It's so apparent when you read the sources, and I mean, like you said, we've heard more complicated, contrived theories, but it's so apparent when you read the sources that there is a genuine relationship, and that Catherine is not under duress, or she's not.
No.
She's not being held against her will to meet with Culpeper in her chambers. She quite clearly.
No, she was the one who organized. And also, I mean, you're right. And also, the only way you can get there is if you decide you've wanted to make this dynamic your narrative beforehand. And if you ignore the testimony of her servants, some of whom said this, describe that they saw how she looked at him. I think Alice Morton that said, that there was a look of such love from Catherine to Thomas. I think Thomas Culpeper, I mean, again, obviously, I should clarify this for people, your listeners who are familiar with the Catherine Howard story, but haven't read my biography of her. I do discuss the theory that Thomas Culpeper was a rapist, not with Catherine, but that this case, the Protestant evangelist Richard Hills records in his letter that there was a rumor that Thomas had sexually assaulted a gamekeeper's wife, and also in the physical affray afterwards murdered someone. And part of the difficulty of being able to tell which Thomas Culpeper he's talking about is, in a move that old Tudor historians will appreciate the enraging fury of, Thomas Culpeper's parents, Alexander and Constance, named both of their sons Thomas, and which was just such a treat. Going through the documents, so I can't say for certain that was this Thomas Culpeper. I think it could have been the brother. It might also. It's very interesting that no one else mentions it. So Hills by this point was living abroad, so it might have been. No one on the ground in England mentions it, which I think is quite interesting because they insulted Culpeper every other way that they could. But I still included it in the book because I think it's important to say, look, this is the evidence. I can't say one way or the other, but it's for you as the reader, to weigh it up. But even leaving that aside, there was something about Culpeper that, again, was difficult to warm to, if I'm honest. And I think it was, I got a sense of their voice in these conversations, and the fun that they had, Catherine and Thomas seem to have a very similar sense of humor. And they sort of joked about their exes, for want of a better word, not always in the kindest of tones, but I think there's always a slight, just a sense of something unpleasant with Culpeper, or at least if you're not as negatively inclined as I am with them, I think there's still a sense of something self-serving and arrogant about him. That's the impression I got from their conversations and their the sources. But again, it's I try to put it all in the books. The reader can follow my logic and also hopefully make up their own mind if they're so inclined.
I think one of the most apt or accurate descriptions I've ever read of Catherine Howard, particularly in the months preceding her arrest, to use your words, overconfidence and nervous insecurity. So when did Catherine go too far? I mean, at precisely what point do you think did she lose her grip on what was an increasingly dangerous situation?
It's a good question. If I had to just, I mean, the moment I refer to it in the book as the Rubicon moment is Lincoln, when she was on the tour of the North with Henry and Culpeper. It was one of her late night conversations, sort of covert rendezvous with Culpeper, and it was at Lincoln that he said that he wouldn't be going near any other woman, and said that he was in love with her. And I think to me, her behavior and his after Lincoln rapidly began to spiral out of control, to the point that she, you see her do things like give these quite cryptic instructions to her maids. She starts threatening to fire some of them. She bans certain ladies in waiting from her bedroom, which was just, I mean, deeply suspicious to the point of lunatic. She increasingly relies solely on Lady Rochford, who of course knows about her and Culpeper. And when they get back to Hampton Court, so she sends Lady Rochford, I think, with a letter, is it Catherine Tilney? And it's full of such cryptic instructions that that Tilney, one of the maids, is confused. And also you have Lady Rochford having to say to Catherine, you have to be careful where you leave your letters. So I think after Lincoln, she became reckless and quite careless with Culpeper. In terms of the moment in the interrogation where I think she lost the plot, which I think is slightly different, the moment where I think she made things a lot harder for herself was calling Archbishop Cranmer back to cancel out the earlier confession that she had given him, and to make the third confession where she kind of says it was all Durham's fault and I wanted nothing to do with it. And I think she didn't know that Cranmer had so many other testimonies to hand that contradicted what she was saying. And I think in that moment, she lost Cranmer's sympathy. And so you then have the moment where Cranmer more or less goes to the king and says, she's lying about what she did before the marriage. She's probably lying about what she did after. So those are the two moments. I think the moment at Lincoln where her and Culpeper confess their love to each other, and the moment at Hampton Court where she tries to save her position as queen by telling something to Cranmer that he knows to be a lie, but she doesn't know that he knows.
What is it, do you think, that makes Catherine Howard's story a tragedy?
The sheer injustice of it all, I think. This is, someone who never really did anything wrong. Yes, she made mistakes, but I don't think Catherine, and there could be moments, I list her faults at the end of the book, and they're all trivial. They're not death penalty worthy. Catherine, really did not deserve what happened to her. And that sounds so reductive and so obvious, but I think at the core of its tragedy is this monstrous disproportionality between her mistakes and the price she paid for them. And the suggestion that people still try to blame everyone but her husband for what happened, for the man who I would argue authored the tragedy, and certainly signed off on it. So I think it's the tragedy of someone who was caught at a terrible moment in history and whose beauty and charm brought her to the attention of someone who was utterly incapable of forgiveness, or of empathy, I would argue. You know, he didn't seem to understand that people could have a past before him, and certainly didn't want them to have a future beyond him, and had the power and judicial apparatus to inflict his very unforgiving view of the world onto those who had disappointed him. So it's an innocent person, I think, fundamentally an innocent person caught at a deeply guilty time in history. That's the tragedy.
I have you quoted in an earlier interview when asked why Catherine. You said that she wouldn't really let you go. So
Yeah.
my question for you is, a decade on since you began your research on Catherine and 3 years since the publication of your book, has Catherine finally let you go?
No. First of all, James, you've really done your research. I am thoroughly impressed.
I sounded a little bit like a stalker when I was reading that question.
No, James, honestly, when someone says to me, I'm quoting you from a previous interview, my heart stops. But yes, so I think certainly there was a moment when I finished the book. I have a little ritual that I check into a hotel for the last night before submission and sort of write up the last few paragraphs. And I checked into the Merchant Hotel here in Belfast and put up a little, I can remember putting up a post. It was like 9:15 in the evening. And I said, you know, dear reader, I just killed her off. And I had a quote from Brideshead Revisited about Julia Flight that is always my, I just think is the most perfect quote to describe Catherine, actually. But I can remember the huge sense of relief at that moment, and also being utterly bereft. I sort of felt, you know, she had been such good company for so many years, and I felt yeah, sort of slightly devastated at the end. And you know, yes, I could sleep again, which was nice. But so in terms of the intensity of writing the biography and researching it to that level, particularly in the last sort of 2 years, yes, she has. I felt that I did my duty to her as her biographer, and I did it as fairly as I could. And yes, so in that sense, she has. But in the sense that sometimes I hear someone say something about her that's crashingly incorrect. And I do feel, I feel every nerve in my body and my soul flare up with the urge to say that's not what she was like, or that's not what happened. So I do still feel protective of the story, and I feel protective of the research. And I think Catherine, you know, from that first moment at the BBC store in Belfast when I picked up that VHS of her, I think Catherine and I are sort of, well, I'm sort of stuck with her really for the rest of my life. You know, I think there are certainly papers I would do. I would probably have a bash at some online articles about, you know, the timing of the Mannix liaison and different aspects that didn't quite make the book, or how she's been presented since. So I'll always be fascinated by her and protective of that story. So it's a haunting that will continue, not with quite the same vigor, but she certainly haunts my life more than she does the Haunted Gallery at Hampton Court. So in that sense, I think
very
her and
well
I,
put. Very well
yeah,
put. I think you are stuck with her, actually, and
oh yeah,
and I look forward to any future articles that you do on Catherine.
well, James, that's very kind, and I have fully accepted that I'm stuck with her.
Good.
So
Good. I think anyone who's read the biography would be upset if you had said that you'd cast her off for somebody else at this stage, because they're really, although it feels like there might not be anything left to say, because I mean it's right there in 400 pages. You know, I mean it's an accomplishment, really. Your next book will be The Palace by the River, The Rise and Fall of an Empire at Hampton Court. So is there anything more you can tell us at this stage?
Yes, well, I sort of Hampton Court again, like Catherine, was accidental because you know, it's there, and it's where Catherine spent her only Christmas as queen, and where her downfall, the early stages of it certainly play out. And so you know, I'm often on tour guide duty for friends and colleagues and relatives, and I think I made a joke once. I think I was back for like the third time in a week, and I said, God, if I never see this place again, it'll be too soon. And then started to think about, and it's because it's the most wonderful place, actually. If you can visit it, do. Hampton Court is just an arc of history, and an arc of the British experience of British history. And I was saying that, and as I started to think about it, I was like, maybe there's something here about, using this story as an arc of the story of the British monarchy. And so how it's structured is each chapter is focused on a different person who lived there, a different room, and a different decade, really moving through from the dawn of the Tudor period right up until the modern era. So it's using the palace in a way that I hope is exciting for people. Certainly some of the people I've picked, I try to move between exiled princes and Tudor queens and kitchen boys and chocolate chefs for George I. So yeah, I mean, I'm trying to tell this gorgeous, wonderful palace's story, but also to weave it into what is the essence of history, which is people's experiences there.
You have definitely piqued my interest, because I
Thank
think
God.
well, you no, seriously, you have, because there is something in writing a history, and something that you do so wonderfully in Young and Damned and Fair, which is that we see so many characters. It is many people's stories, in a sense, with Catherine, alongside Catherine. And so when you say you're going to cover not just the queens but the kitchen boys, fantastic, and I honestly cannot wait to read it. So I look forward to that. And
Thank you so much.
Gareth, thank you so much for your time today and for answering my questions.
No,
Hope they
you.
weren't too burdensome and too
No, they were
difficult.
great. I really enjoyed them. Thank you for having me.
No,
My pleasure.
That was Gareth Russell discussing Young and Damned and Fair. If you would like to join the Six Wives Book Club, read along and take part in the discussion, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and check out sixwives.com/bookclub. Thank you for listening.